They don't build cars like they used to sometimes. That's a good thing. From crank windows to strange buttons tucked into dashboards, yesterday's rides were full of features that once felt futuristic. For drivers of the past, these quirks were not just extras. They were part of what made every car feel alive, like a machine with its own personality. Today, most of them have vanished, remembered only in family photos, old commercials, or the faint smell of vinyl seats on a summer day. In the golden decades of the 1970s through the 1990s, automakers were bold enough to experiment. It was a time when engineers believed that innovation meant trying almost anything once. Some cars came with gadgets that looked like science fiction, while others carried details that seemed almost whimsical. The goal wasn't always practicality. Sometimes it was about giving drivers a sense of excitement, a small surprise that made them feel their vehicle was more than a way to get from one place to another. Manufacturers competed fiercely in this era, each eager to stand out in a crowded market. If one brand offered a unique door design, another countered with a flashy headlight trick. If a luxury car installed a built-in phone, a competitor added a dashboard television. The features didn't always last long, and many were more frustrating than helpful, but they sparked conversation. Neighbors would lean over the hood at a block party, just to marvel at the oddities a new model carried. These touches built character into vehicles in ways that seem almost unimaginable today. A car wasn't just steel and rubber, it was a memory machine. For some, it was the rattle of a manual window crank, the groan of an ashtray sliding open, or the soft pop of headlights rising at dusk. For others, it was the embarrassment of explaining to a friend how to use the backward-opening suicide doors on a classic Lincoln. These quirks were woven into daily life, and they stitched themselves into the nostalgia of a generation. Looking back, what stands out most is the feeling of discovery. Every car felt like an experiment, a chance to explore what driving could become. Even if a feature was strange or short-lived, it gave people something to remember, something to laugh about years later. Cars were not yet stripped down to efficiency. They still had room for personality, even if it came at the cost of convenience. Today, when most vehicles look and feel the same, those unusual details remind us of a time when designers were unafraid to be playful. They remind us that once, cars carried a sense of wonder, even if the ideas didn't always work out. But as the decades rolled on, these once exciting add-ons started to lose their shine. Once the symbol of cool sports cars, pop-up headlights are now a relic of another age. They rose from the hood like a pair of blinking eyes, turning an ordinary drive into a small performance. For a generation of car lovers, nothing said sporty, quite like that soft whir and click as the lights appeared, glowing against the night. They gave cars a face, a personality that could shift from sleek and mysterious in daylight to bold and animated once the sun went down. The 1970s through the 1990s were the golden years of the pop-up headlight. From the Corvette to the RX-7 to the Miata, they became a defining design trait, making sports cars look futuristic in an era when people believed the future might arrive on four wheels. They weren't just lights. They were a statement. Owning a car with pop-ups meant turning heads on the street, catching a glance at a stoplight, or watching kids point as the headlights winked to life. Yet behind their charm, the engineering told a more complicated story. Each headlight relied on small motors, linkages, and delicate parts that had to work in perfect harmony. When new, they felt like magic. But as cars aged, the magic often faltered. One headlight might rise slower than the other. A tired motor might freeze halfway, leaving the car with a lopsided stare. For many owners, what once felt like futuristic design became a regular repair bill. The charm of pop-ups also collided with new concerns about safety. By the late 1990s, stricter pedestrian protection laws required smoother, less hazardous car fronts. The very design that made pop-ups so appealing, the sharp edges and sudden rise from the hood, was now considered a risk. Automakers quietly phased them out, replacing the once iconic feature with sleeker, fixed designs that fit new regulations and simplified maintenance. Still, nostalgia has a way of keeping memories alive. Car enthusiasts continue to celebrate pop-up headlights at shows and online communities. They remember the thrill of pressing the switch, watching the lights rise like a curtain lifting on a stage. Younger fans, too, see them as a lost art form, something playful in an automotive world that has grown increasingly uniform and serious. But as much as people may miss them, pop-up headlights aren't coming back. The realities of safety, aerodynamics, and modern design leave no room for them. They belong to a time when cars dared to feel animated, when a small mechanical flourish could make a driver smile. Today, they survive only in memory and in the classics that still roam the streets, winking their headlights like ghosts from another era. And headlights weren't the only design quirk. Sometimes the strangeness was built right into the doors. Opening your car door backwards? Once considered luxurious, now just dangerous. Suicide doors, as they came to be known, were one of the boldest design choices in automotive history. Hinged at the rear instead of the front, they swung open in a way that felt elegant and theatrical. For decades, they were associated with sophistication, especially on long, stately cars like the Lincoln Continental. A chauffeur opening those wide doors for passengers was more than a gesture. It was a performance of class and style. The beauty often came with a hidden price. Rear hinge doors posed a real safety concern. If one wasn't closed properly, the wind at highway speeds could rip it open, endangering anyone inside. In an accident, passengers seated near a suicide door were more vulnerable, since the door could fling wide instead of locking tighter under pressure. Even their name, suicide doors, hinted at the danger people sensed beneath the polished surface. Still, their reputation gave them a certain mystique. Enthusiasts loved the way they transformed an everyday moment stepping out of a car into something dramatic. The sheer space they created made climbing in and out easier, especially for those dressed in the sharp suits and flowing dresses of mid-century America. They were quirky, glamorous, and just impractical enough to feel special. Sliding doors told another story. Today, most people think of minivans when they hear the phrase, but automakers once experimented with sliding doors on regular cars too. It was meant to be clever and efficient, saving space in tight parking spots. In practice, though, it often looked odd and felt out of place. A sliding door on a compact car didn't exactly scream excitement, it whispered compromise. While practical in theory, it never quite caught on outside of family vans, where convenience outweighed style. These unusual door designs remind us of a time when automakers were willing to push boundaries, even if the results didn't always stick. They wanted cars to feel different, to make drivers and passengers feel like they were part of something new. And for all their faults, suicide doors in particular have held on to a cool factor that never really faded. Even now, when they reappear in limited editions or concept cars, they spark the same reaction: surprise, admiration, and a little bit of nostalgia. Because quirks like these weren't just about function, they were about personality. They gave cars a sense of theater, of flair, even when the risks outweighed the benefits. Today's vehicles may be safer and smarter, but they rarely inspire the same kind of wide-eyed fascination. If the doors weren't unusual enough, the steering wheel had its own strange experiments. From square wheels to single-spoke designs, car steering once looked more like art than function. In an age when automakers seemed determined to stand apart, even the humble steering wheel became a canvas for creativity. It wasn't enough for it to be round and practical. It had to be memorable, a feature that made a driver feel like they were sitting in the cockpit of the future. The 1970s and 1980s were full of bold experiments. Cadillac once introduced a square steering wheel, a sharp-edged design that looked sleek in brochures but felt awkward in daily use. Aston Martin followed suit with its Lagonda, giving drivers a wheel that seemed more suited to a spaceship than a luxury car. The novelty was undeniable. Sitting behind such a wheel made even a simple drive to the store feel like a mission launch. But as many owners discovered, sharp corners and flat edges didn't help when it came to precision driving. The round wheel had stayed round for a reason. Other companies tried subtler twists. Citroën, always a brand with an eye for the unusual, gave the DS a single-spoke steering wheel. At first glance, it looked fragile, almost unfinished, as if the rest of the wheel had been forgotten in production. But the single spoke was a deliberate choice, offering a cleaner view of the dashboard and adding a futuristic flair to the cabin. For some drivers, it became a mark of sophistication. For others, it felt like a gimmick that sacrificed sturdiness for style. These experiments sparked debates that stretched beyond car enthusiasts. Was it better for a steering wheel to look innovative, or was safety the only measure that mattered? In an era before airbags became standard, these unusual designs raised concerns about strength and control. A wheel that looked bold in a showroom could feel unsteady during sharp turns or emergency maneuvers. Some of the most futuristic concepts never even made it past prototypes. Designers toyed with shapes and control systems that felt more like arcade joysticks or airplane yokes. They imagined a future where driving would be less about muscle and more about minimal hand movements. The vision was daring, but the reality never lined up. The familiar round wheel kept proving itself as the best compromise between comfort, safety, and precision. Today, steering wheels are far less adventurous. The priority is clear: airbags, ergonomics, and standardized controls for radios, phones, and navigation systems. Function has triumphed over flair. Yet, in their own quirky way, those past experiments remind us of a time when automakers believed driving should feel dramatic, when even the shape of a wheel was part of the story. But it wasn't the wheel car interiors that were once loaded with gadgets we'd never use today. Once a standard feature, now an uncomfortable reminder of a different time. For decades, the smell of cigarette smoke was as much a part of car interiors as leather seats or vinyl dashboards. Ashtrays and lighters weren't optional extras. They were built into every vehicle, as natural to the design as the steering wheel. Families accepted them without a second thought. The driver flicked the lighter, the glowing coil lit up, and the small clink of ashes dropping into a tray became part of the rhythm of the road. It's difficult to imagine today just how common these features were. Cars didn't just come with one ashtray. They often had several, one for the driver, one for the passenger, and sometimes small flip-out trays for backseat riders. Door panels, armrests, and center consoles carried tiny slots that waited for cigarettes to be tapped clean. Even lighters were everywhere, doubling as universal power plugs before USB ports took their place. It wasn't just convenience. It was an acknowledgement that smoking was woven into everyday life. For many families, the car was a private space where smoking went unquestioned. Children sat in the back, fog swirling around them, while parents drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding a cigarette. Road trips carried the mixed scent of upholstery, fuel, and tobacco, a combination so ordinary that few ever paused to think of it as strange. Ads of the time often showed glamorous drivers with a cigarette in hand, reinforcing the idea that smoking in the car was stylish, even sophisticated. But culture began to shift. As health warnings grew louder and the dangers of secondhand smoke became undeniable, attitudes changed. The very features that once seemed natural now looked careless, even harmful. Automakers slowly began removing ashtrays and built-in lighters from new models, replacing them with simple storage compartments or auxiliary power outlets. By the 2000s, the car interior had been redesigned to reflect a new reality. Smoking was no longer seen as a normal part of the drive. Today, finding an ashtray in a modern vehicle feels like uncovering a relic. They survive mostly in older models, classic cars, or as nostalgic curiosities at auctions. What once symbolized normalcy now feels out of place, a reminder of how quickly cultural standards can shift. A feature that once served millions of families is now something younger generations barely recognize, a story parents and grandparents tell with a shake of the head. These changes remind us that cars evolve not just with technology, but with the values of the people who drive them. The disappearance of ashtrays and lighters marked more than just the end of a design trend. It reflected a cultural decision about health, safety, and family life. But not every feature disappeared because of health. Some just aged out of usefulness. Remember rolling down your window by hand? A workout every time you want air. For much of the 20th century, this was the reality of driving. A metal crank sat on every door, waiting for a few swift turns to let in a breeze. It was simple, mechanical, and reliable, but also a reminder that every small adjustment came with effort. In a world before automatic everything, cars required a little more muscle and sometimes a little more patience. Manual windows were only the beginning. Locks clicked up and down with a push of the thumb. Mirrors had to be adjusted by leaning halfway across the seat, and trunks popped open only with a key. These details sound minor now, but at the time, they defined the driving experience. Each task added a tiny ritual to the rhythm of owning a car. Rolling the windows down in the summer, locking each door one by one, or fiddling with the rearview mirror. Until it finally sat just right, all of it gave cars a sense of interaction that modern buttons have smoothed away. Still, the charm came at a cost. On hot days, passengers often fought over who had to crank their window down first, and children in the back seat sometimes turned the handles into toys, battling to roll them up or down faster than their siblings. Parents groaned, but for kids, those moments became small, silly memories of family road trips. What seemed like a hassle then is remembered now with a smile, part of the innocence of a slower time. As technology advanced, though, these manual features started to look more like inconveniences than traditions. Power windows, locks, and mirrors once belonged only to luxury models, but by the 1980s and 1990s, they became affordable enough to spread across nearly every car. The difference was impossible to ignore. With one press, every door could lock at once. With another, windows slid down smoothly, sparing the cranking arms of countless drivers. What had been standard for generations quickly became outdated, a reminder of how fast convenience reshapes expectations. Today, finding crank windows in a new car is almost impossible. They linger only in a few stripped-down models built for utility fleets or budget markets, where durability outweighs comfort. For most drivers, they seem quaint, a quirky throwback to another era. Sitting in an old car and rolling the window down by hand now feels less like a chore and more like a glimpse into the past when simplicity ruled the road. Nostalgia gives these features a warm glow, but it can't hide the truth. Manual everything may be memorable, but it's also impractical in a world that prizes speed and ease. Once, they were normal. Now, they are reminders of how far technology has carried us and how quickly we've left the old ways behind. Still, some features weren't just inconvenient. They were downright strange experiments. Long before iPhones, before Bluetooth, before streaming playlists on the go, your car could have its very own telephone. For a brief, flashy moment in the 1980s and 1990s, built-in car phones were the ultimate symbol of success. Nestled into center consoles or mounted on dashboards, these bulky handsets made drivers feel like Wall Street executives, even if the signal barely reached beyond city limits. Luxury brands like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Cadillac offered them as premium options, often advertised with a sense of futuristic flair. The idea was irresistible. Make calls from the road, close a deal on the highway, or call home without hunting down a payphone. In reality, though, the experience wasn't quite so seamless. The phones were heavy, required their own wiring, and operated through expensive networks with spotty coverage. What was marketed as cutting edge often ended in static-filled conversations or dead air. Despite the drawbacks, car phones carried an undeniable aura of prestige. Seeing one in a vehicle instantly signaled wealth and importance. They weren't just tools. They were status symbols, props in the performance of success. Movies and TV shows of the era leaned into this image, using car phones as shorthand for power and influence. Even if few people actually used them regularly, their presence alone spoke volumes. Practicality, however, was another story. The clunky receivers, cluttered interiors, sometimes housed in leather holsters that looked more like old payphone booths than sleek technology. Cords tangled, buttons jammed, and installation added a hefty sum to the already expensive cars that carried them. For most drivers, the idea of paying extra for a car phone made little sense when cell phones were rapidly shrinking in size and cost. By the late 1990s, the tide had already turned. Portable cell phones became affordable, networks expanded, and suddenly a device tied to your car felt more like a limitation than an innovation. The once glamorous built-in phone quickly became obsolete, abandoned as fast as it had appeared. Within a decade, what was once a symbol of luxury looked like an outdated curiosity, the tech equivalent of an 8-track tape deck. Today, spotting a car phone is like uncovering a time capsule. Collectors may smile at the novelty, and some enthusiasts even keep them installed for authenticity, but no one's making calls on them anymore. They're relics of a transitional era, when the promise of mobility collided with the clunky reality of early technology. And if a phone wasn't enough, some cars even came with entertainment systems no one asked for. Yes, some cars actually came with built-in TVs and VCRs. For a brief stretch in the 1980s and 1990s, a handful of luxury vehicles tried to turn the family sedan into a rolling living room. A small CRT screen would be tucked into the dashboard, sometimes no bigger than a portable radio, glowing faintly as if promising the future. The pitch was simple. Why not bring the comforts of home on the road? In practice, though, nobody really watched them. The technology just wasn't there. Reception was fuzzy, channels were limited, and the picture quality made even the evening news hard to follow. Many of these early screens doubled as rudimentary navigation aids, long before GPS became reliable. But instead of sleek maps, drivers got clunky grid displays and directions that felt more confusing than helpful. For entertainment, a built-in VCR could be hooked up, but imagine the logistics of bulky tapes, limited storage, and the awkwardness of loading up a cartoon just to keep the kids busy for a short drive. Automakers like Lexus, Cadillac, and even some Japanese brands leaned into the idea, hoping to wow customers with futuristic extras. The marketing promised innovation, but most owners quickly realized these gadgets were more gimmick than game-changer. For drivers, the novelty wore off once they discovered how distracting, and sometimes downright dangerous, it was to have a TV glowing in the dash. For passengers, the screens were too small and poorly placed to compete with simply waiting until you got home. The cost didn't help either. Repairing these early systems was notoriously expensive. A broken VCR deck or a dead CRT screen often cost hundreds, sometimes thousands, to replace. And with technology evolving so rapidly in the 1990s, what seemed advanced one year was outdated the next. Portable DVD players and later flip-down monitors quickly leapfrogged past these built-ins, making them look clumsy and outdated almost overnight. Looking back, these TV and VCR setups feel like a classic case of cars trying too hard to be more than cars. They were symbols of ambition, proof that the industry was reaching for the future, even if it was a future no one truly needed. Today, they survive mostly as curiosities, reminders of an era when bigger and flashier always seemed better until reality caught up. But even the strangest gadgets couldn't compete with the odd design choices on the outside. Car features come and go, but everyone tells the story of its time. Each forgotten gadget, every odd design choice, speaks of an era when cars weren't just machines, but canvases of imagination. From headlights that winked open like sleepy eyes to phones that made you feel important, even when no one was on the other end. These features captured the spirit of the decades that created them. They weren't perfect. They weren't always practical, but they made cars feel alive in a way that today, as polished technology sometimes can too. In the graveyard of forgotten features lies a history lesson. Pop-up headlights remind us of a time when sleekness mattered more than regulations. Cigarette lighters scattered through every door tell us how normal smoking once was in daily life. Crank windows and manual locks show how convenience wasn't always guaranteed, but often earned with effort. Even those strange TVs and car phones whisper about a culture rushing to embrace the future, even if it stumbled along the way. Technology, safety, and culture pushed these features aside, one by one. Laws demanded safer designs. Health campaigns reshaped habits, and cheaper innovations made the old ways unnecessary. What once seemed luxurious or futuristic now looks clunky, even laughable. Yet hidden inside that change is something tender, a reminder of how quickly the world moves and how easily the everyday becomes history. For many, nostalgia lingers. There is a kind of charm in rolling down a window by hand or hearing the soft click of an ashtray closing. These details connect us to moments long gone: family road trips, first cars, weekends spent polishing dashboards that now seem dated. It's proof that even the quirkiest inventions leave emotional fingerprints, outlasting their usefulness in the memories they created. And maybe that's the lesson. Today's touchscreens, driver assist systems, and connected apps feel modern, even essential. But one day, they too may look outdated, tucked into the same graveyard where crank windows and pop-up headlights rest. Cars, in this way, are more than transportation. They're time capsules of culture and innovation, mirrors of what people once valued, dreamed about, or simply thought was cool. So when we look back at these forgotten features, it's not just about what disappeared. It's about remembering the joy of experimentation, the charm of imperfection, and the way even the strangest ideas help drive us forward. After all, every car carries not just people, but pieces of history. And maybe you remember some of these quirks yourself. Which forgotten feature lived in your first car?